And we're back. Hope everybody had a happy holidays. Welcome everybody in. This is the Mind Sculptors podcast. I am your host, Callahan, and I am joined by some terrific co-hosts today. Joining me from the center of where all the Omicron, I guess, raining hell, our good friend, Cobblepott. Cobble, how you doing today?
Doing well. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's avoiding the masses, I hear.
Yep. We stay inside. It can't get in. We're hiding.
What do you guys do for grocery shopping? You do like the ordering stuff? Or?
Right. We do delivery.
Okay. Nice.
And there's also a curbside pickup. So what we'll do is, you drive up and pop your trunk, and then they throw it in the trunk, and then off you go. So
nice. Well, that's awesome. I'm glad you're staying safe up there. I know the Cleveland area is kind of on fire right now.
Yes, it definitely is.
Also joining us this week as our co-host is, again, you know him, you love him. He's up there from Boston. I can't get, that was an awful attempt at a Boston accent.
That was a wicked good.
It's O's or A's, right? It's from Boston.
Yes, Boston.
Yeah, there you go.
It's not Boston.
It's our good friend Ian, otherwise known as Comedian MTG. How you doing today, buddy?
Hello, I am doing well. We are also in the Omicron sort of mess up here, but that's just because it's cold and diseases love the cold.
Yeah, it was so funny when we were traveling for Christmas. There was some lady in a restaurant we were at who's like, yeah, I'm glad it's cold because the diseases just don't do as well in the cold. They really flourish in the hot heat. And I'm just sitting there thinking to myself, I'm like, I don't think that's how that works. But
no,
when is cold and flu symptom?
Yeah, exactly. And now I was reading, there is now a COVID/flu variant. So if you didn't think COVID could get any worse, it just keeps getting worse. So the moral of the story is get your vaccine, get fully vaccinated, wear a mask, and just don't be a fucking idiot. That's the most political thing you'll hear on this show is
and just moving on.
Yeah. So we all had good holidays, and while we were off on break, I was, busy doing some stuff, but we also made some.
The ambiguity of, I was doing stuff.
Well,
don't worry about it.
I got married over the break. So, it's gonna be exciting moving forward. So I'm no longer a single individual. I am, or
you are now
legally
partnered.
single. Yeah, I'm now partnered. But we were also working on some decks. And one of the decks you should all know because I've been yelling about it for literal months now.
Into the void.
Yeah, it's literally just screaming into the Twitter sphere. Is, of course, we're going to be, you could tell by the title of the episode, is we're doing a Brewer's Choice episode, but this time we're building around Arden, and we get to choose whatever partner we want to go with it. So, of course, for me, I just said, you know what? This is a great time to get on a soapbox and really dig into my favorite deck right now, Jeskai Stoneblade. So I'm going to be talking about Arden Crom. Ian brought probably the most wild of the three, I would say.
Is it?
I was not expecting it. I will say that. I was certainly not expecting it. Is Arden Vial Smasher, so Mardu Arden, and Cobblepott gave us that good old classic Arden Tana Naya. Here's a bunch of creatures and equipment, and I'm going to smack you in the face stuff. So we'll start over here with Ian. We're looking at, you called it Smacks and Stacks. So tell us a little bit about this. Looking at the list, it looks like it's Secret Commander Winota, right?
No. like it is, but not from design,
right?
Which I know anyone hearing this is going to be like, yeah, okay. And Winota was actually one of the last cards I added to the deck, ironically, because I wanted to make sure that the numbers were appropriate for Winota. But turns out something that I keep learning from my stacks adventures is that there's a reason Winota worked in the first place, and it's because the balance of humans and non-humans in the stacks world is actually just kind of exactly where you want to be. So Winota is in the 99 of this deck, but the central conceit behind it was I wanted to have, well, first of all, I didn't want to do the Naya variant because I didn't want to do what had been done in the database, and I had a feeling one of us was going to also do the Naya variant as well. So I was like, I want to do something different. And to me, the big appeal of Arden is the Godo combo, which I assume we'll go over when we go into the win cons. But so my thought was, how do I best? So I needed red, right? How do I best utilize the fact that I have a 1-card combo in the deck? Well, Black's tutors seem pretty good at getting a 1-card combo. And the rest of the deck sort of formed in place around that central idea. So literally, I think my deck list, the first cards were Arden, Vile Smasher, Helm, Godo, every tutor Black had to offer.
All right. Cool. We've established a baseline.
Yeah, exactly.
My deck, I guess, is next on the list, and Jeskai Stoneblade is something that I've talked a lot about on the podcast and on Twitter. But for those of you who have managed to avoid me yelling about this, the general gist of this deck is it's almost like the iconic Decklist challenge almost.
Yeah.
All over again, where I was just like, I kind of wanted to see if I was able to translate kind of that Jeskai Stoneblade control. What's the word I'm looking for? Archetype.
Yeah.
And in Modern, and how can that translate over into Commander? And so a lot of what it started off was using this, and I think I've discussed this in Brewer's Choice previously, but was using the same, if there's 4 Steel Shaper's gifts in the deck, I need to have 4 or proportional in my deck,
right?
That many tutors for this thing in my deck. And if there's 20 counter spells total in the deck, then I need to have that proportional in my deck as well. So what pretty much came about through this was a deck that was didn't have Godo in it originally, but used stuff like Rule of Law to emulate the effect that Teferi Time Raveler has in this deck in Modern. Because you don't want to have that same effect in cEDH, because you're just going to end up handing the game to somebody.
Right.
Because the reality is you're not going to have the answer all the time, and you kind of need 2 other people to help you out. And that's just kind of the reality of playing Control in Commander. We discussed this before, right? There's one deck that gets to play Teferi, and that is Sisay. All others don't get to play it.
So true.
But through playing this a bunch, Ian had pointed out to me, a while ago, Godo just fits really well into the shell, because both halves of the combo just do a really good job of, worst case scenario, you play Helm and you attach it to Crom, and oh no, I have 2 Croms. Whatever shall I do?
Yeah, that's worst case.
Yeah, and so it's like your worst case scenario is still really good. Or you could get multiple Ardens, which is also pretty hot because you can do some really, really fucky stuff with it.
There is no better way to describe that.
There really isn't, because it's just it's messy and gooey and it's awful. And you get to, if you have a what's the card I'm thinking of? If you have a Skull Clamp on you get multiple skull clamp attaches because it gets real fucky. However, so there's that. And then Godo is just like that. And then you just kind of have to add Search for Glory. I felt like it just fit in really well because it's able to get a lot of different pieces in the deck, as well as is a really simple tutor to find either half of the combo.
So good, this deck.
It's so good. And it just fills a slot. And from there, it's just a bunch of counter spells and stacks pieces and Rest in Peace and Counterbalance and Rule of Law and 31 lands because we're old school. But yeah, I love this deck. I've had nothing but fun with this. And my opponents have not had fun playing against it. But yeah, that's Jeskai Stoneblade. Cobble, tell us about your deck, a Big Voltron Snowball.
Right. The snowball there is meant as a nod to the Winota snowball stacks. And contrary to Ian, I was definitely thinking as this list would be a kind of like a hidden commander Winota. So because of the fact that Arden is white and a lot of the enchantment or not the equipment synergies, especially, Godo, is in red. It's, I wanted to be able to incorporate Winota and
Godo is a human too, which is a very attractive option.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
And, because one of the best things that red and white can be doing is Rule of Law stacks. Winota lends itself very well to be able to break parity with the Rule of Law. And in looking for that third color, green just made a whole lot of sense. For one, because it gives you access to Birthing Pod, which allows you to be able to kind of selectively slot in the stacks that you need depending on the situation that's happening on the board. And it also lets you use Tana, the Blood Sower, as your partner, which does pretty well when you give it a hammer or a Belt of Giant Strength and let it make 10 or 12 Saprolings when it hits, because Saprolings trigger Winota. And if you've ever swung and gotten 10 or more Winota triggers, the game does not last very long after that.
Usually ends right there for what it's worth.
Kind of. If you don't find a combo, people just kind of say, there's no getting out of this. And
we have lost.
We have an understanding, you and I.
Right.
Yeah.
But it also lets you do some other things too. There's a lot of good draw in green, through Orin Frostfang and, Toski, Bearer of Secrets. And of course you can use Kadama to break your parity with Rule of Law as well. So that also happens quite a bit, which works very nicely with Winota because you can.
That's gross.
You can
I don't approve of this.
And then trigger Winota a bunch of times, and you put humans into play, and each of those humans triggers Kadama, which lets you put things from your hand onto the battlefield. And then when they hit, you draw cards. And
this is really offensive.
It's great.
I'm going to need you to not. It's very interesting to look at the way all of our decks kind of evolved. I built a very traditional control list, right? 10 creatures in my deck, and I am playing like 29 instants. I would say a vast majority of them are counter spells or removal spells, or some combination of that.
Yeah, I feel like I'm playing like, hey, you like hate bears?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I was kind of getting at, is it's interesting to look at the lists and see where we all saw different things that you can do with this, which is why, again, what I really liked about Arden is you kind of feel like when you first look at it, it is going to push you in one direction. And then you realize, oh, there's like a zillion things that I can do with this. So when we're looking at going back to your list here, Ian, what are, outside of, Godo Helm, what are some of the win cons in this list?
So, yeah, the list is very focused on getting Godo Helm. Like that is a pretty instrumental part of the deck. And then the rest of it is kind of just tempo stacks, right? And I know tempo is such like a triggering word for cEDH, but when you have rule of laws in play and then you're sort of just kind of grinding the value out, you're playing parity breaking pieces. Like I'm playing Timna in here, I'm playing Winota, I'm playing a number of, what I would consider very crippling stacks pieces. I tried to get as many pieces in here that I can break parity on as possible, but that are like, if I am against these pieces, they're always going to be the ones that make me sigh and go, oh, I just didn't want to see this one right now. And I think about the best stuff to be doing in the format. I have things like Rest in Peace, Rule of Law, Graph Diggers, like all of the things that I think are very impactful at the current moment, Dranith, and every single Rule of Law effect available to me. And then, so having that lockdown potential, kind of lends itself to then going, okay, and now how the hell do we win? Which is just beating the ever living piss out of your opponents with some of these equipment or getting Godo.
Right.
I'm always going to be, and it's the mono red player in me, but like, I'm always going to aim for that. Like, no, I'm just going to win the game right now thing. But if I have to pivot, if they blow up my Godo, I'm definitely gonna be like, all right, well, here's a Bloodforged battle axe. This is going to get out of hand rather quickly.
Right. Yeah. And that's kind of, it's interesting the way we all kind of went at it, because we all kind of took different angles at this, like protect the queen sort of strategy.
Yeah.
Because, like for me with Godo, the hope is that by the time I've gotten Godo down, I have so many cards in hand. Right. That I can protect whatever. And so there's also the fun, you're hoping that you can do those sorts of things. And then you're also able to just play a grindy game anyway, right? Because we're playing Crom. So we're pressuring people's life totals pretty quickly out of the gates anyhow.
I'm very glad you pivoted it away from being hard Rule of Law because of the anti-synergy with Crom. I think that definitely more of the tempo, because obviously you still are playing like Rule of Law pieces, but the tempo pieces of like the counter spell and the counter magic, I think definitely plays a little better into having Crom in the command zone. Now, obviously Crom being just like a flying hasty beater that can get suited up with Arden is obviously still very good, right? Like evasion is super important when you're going into grindy games.
It's one of those things too, where I think I've had this philosophical debate where if you're playing like some people feel like if you are playing any amount of Rule of Law, you have to be on all of them or, or not. And my kind of stance on it is I think it really depends on the deck, right? Because in a deck like this, we aren't aggressively using Rule of Law as like you think about a lot of other decks that want to aggressively mulligan to a Rule of Law. You think of like Heliod, right? For this we're playing a control deck and we're using the control pieces. I want to see, we talked about this in our episode with Michael Cobble, where we were talking about Rule of Law and how you can use them in different capacities. Right. And it really uses it as almost like a protection spell for your counter spells, where you don't want to be doing a lot of actions on your turn. You want to be doing most of your actions on other people's turns, and you use Arden so that you can maximize your action economy on your turn without casting spells. So it's really fun. there's that aspect to it. Of course, the win con is Godo, or just beating people to death, which is also real fun.
And it's I feel like people are going to listen to this episode and be like, no, right, and beating people to death, I get it. Like, whatever, hippies. Like, that's not how we see EDH. But I feel like the biggest problem with Arden historically, or like combat damage historically, sorry, not Arden, is that the efficiency doesn't match what we're doing in the format. But when you have a threat like Crom that really doesn't even need equipment to like be an annoying threat at the table, especially when the games slow down to a halt, and then suddenly you're doing something like doubling its power, or, you know, it's every time it
giving
hits you,
it's protection from red and blue,
giving it pro red blue, drawing a card, having it ping things when it deals damage to you. Like, those things add up very, very quickly. And the game changes. It's the same reason that like Kenrith is upsettingly good in the stacks, like grind fest, right? It's because the amount of like agency you get during those moments, like the rest of the deck's setting things up to be that way. That's setting up the game to reflect that idea. And then your command zone is saying, okay, now when it gets to this point, I'm going to win these games because I'm set up to do that. I'm set up to create a board state and then break parity on it.
Yeah. Very, very interesting to see that. And I really do like those points, because you do have to be kind of a clever player to play in the late game like that. I will admit.
Oh, very much so.
Because it's very easy to whoopsie daisy yourself into losing.
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, that's kind of the fun of these more challenging decks.
Yes.
There's also the whole Winona aspect, which you don't really need to be all that clever, honestly. But
whoa, hey, wait.
If you can, if you can, in one combat, put 4+ stacks effects onto the battlefield, and you know, people talk about, you know, the intractability of having, you know, redundancy of rule of law, where you've got like rule of law and Eidolon of Rhetoric and Archon of Emeria. It's, yes, if somebody's able to pull off a Cyclonic Rift, that's like their only hope. And, you know, if you get into a situation with, you know, Archon of Valor's Reach and say no one can play instance, then people are like, okay, so yeah, you were serious about combat damage actually being significant, because you put people very, very quickly into a situation where their ability to play the game that they want to play is just turned off, and the clock ticks very quickly.
Right. Well, one thing, so I think we should, as we're talking about win cons and we're talking about like our Arden and why Arden is so cool. Because I do think Arden lends itself very naturally to the sort of tempo control-y stacksy decks. Like, I feel like it just kind of naturally pushes you in that direction.
I don't think you can ever play that as a fast deck, to be honest.
Yeah. There's two interactions that I think is worth discussing with Arden in before we move on, that I think for our listening audience, we need to just explain a little bit. So the first interaction is probably an interaction you've heard a little bit about before, which is Arden and Skull Clamp. And because of the way Arden reads, Arden says at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may attach any number of auras and equipment you control to target permanent or player. So, you know, obviously R&D's doing this. They worded it in such a way so that you could attach like curses to people and all sorts of different things. But it is worded in a way that you can attach it to other people's like creatures. So if you have a Skull Clamp in play, you control the Skull Clamp, and your opponent has, let's say, Llanowar Elves out. You go to combat, you trigger Arden to equip your Skull Clamp to their Llanowar Elves. Their Llanowar Elves dies, and you draw 2 cards. And it is the most satisfying. And the reason you draw the 2 cards is because you're the controller of the equipment.
Yeah, no matter who it's equipped to, you still own it.
Correct. Well, it never leaves your side of the board, even if it's equipped to somebody.
Despite how you may have to physically handle the cards.
Right. But it is under your control. It's on your battlefield. It's just equipped to somebody else's creature. And that's one of the big, nice benefits, is especially when you're playing up against maybe a Winota deck or something like that plays those little 1/1s that come and dink and dunk on you. You can come and kind of get some card advantage out of it while also doing some crowd control. The other thing, and this was something we were talking about pre-show, was how Arden functions with Godo and Helm of the Host. Because there was some confusion about whether or not it would trigger Godo. So, Ian, you were explaining this a little bit, but the gist of it is that the Helm of the Host trigger goes on the stack even when it's not equipped. And so it checks, that trigger checks to see if there's an equipped creature on it upon resolution. So you go to combat, Godo's out, you have Helm of the Host out on the battlefield with Arden. You move to your combat step. You have 2 triggers. You have your Arden trigger and you have your Helm of the Host trigger. You put your Helm of the Host trigger on the bottom of the stack and you put your Arden trigger on the top of the stack. You resolve the Arden trigger to move your Helm of the Host onto Godo. And then you go to resolve your Helm of the Host. It sees Godo. It makes a copy of Godo. And there you have it. That's how that combo works.
Right.
And if you were, we don't have cameras in the podcast, but Ian and Cobble could see me. It goes like this and then this, and I put my hands over top.
He's using his hands quite a bit.
Very hand wavy. I'm a judge.
No better way to describe the stack than using your hands like little stacked pancakes. And I feel like every single time I do it, it's every single time like little hands stacking up on top of each other.
Yeah. But that was just something we were discussing earlier, and that was like an interaction that I think is a little unintuitive. Because you wouldn't think, they both say at the beginning of combat, so your initial thought is, oh, well, the Helm of the Host won't be able to trigger because there's nothing on it when it's triggering, but it checks upon resolution, which is super cool because Arden makes that win
not for
real
your
fast.
Opponents.
Yeah. So with that being said, so Cobble, take us through some of the, you were discussing like Archon of Valor's Reach and Winota, but just, in some more detail, the WinCon package of your list.
Right. So 3 of my WinCons actually include Helm of the Host, just so there's not a single, boogeyman for people to remove and get rid of. Obviously, there's the Godo interaction with Helm, but there's also Combat Celebrant, which is effectively the same thing. So even the way that you stack the triggers and so on, it's the same concept that you're applying there. Archon of Valor's Reach, normally what you do is once it comes into play, you assign it instant so that your opponents can't cast counter spells. They can't cast a lot of their tutors. They can't use most of the removal that they have, and in particular, Cyclonic Rift. And if you put a Helm of the Host on Archon of Valor's Reach, each token that you create is an Archon, but you get to choose. It doesn't have to have the same assigned card type with it. So each one can, each of the tokens can have a different card type. So if you put an Archon onto the battlefield and then move to combat, attach Helm of the Host and get another Archon and say sorcery, now your opponents can't cast instants or sorceries. And for the majority of decks, that is going to be pretty insurmountable for them to be able to put their game plan together. And that is just another one of the angles where we're trying to completely change the tempo of the game such that we have enough time to put together a win through combat damage or through one of our combos.
Is that a White Claw, Ian? You're muted.
It's an energy drink.
Okay. I was like, man, I didn't know it was 5:00 yet.
Right.
I guess
it's
it is
5:30.
Yeah.
We're also in green, so Finale of Devastation. People never.
One of the coolest things I like about your list is that you can Yisan into your Godo. Yes, which I really like.
Yep. An earlier version of this did a lot more. It did a lot more kind of stuff on other people's turns. So it had Seedborn Muse and Oswald Fiddlebender, and did a lot of stuff where is it Mike? I'm trying to think of
Mike, Dungeon Master.
Mike is the one who allows you to return a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield, and you could do the thing where you have which ranger is it?
Ranger Captain of Eos.
Ranger Captain of Eos. You sack it and then have Mike put it back onto the battlefield, and then on the next person's upkeep, you do it again and just lock everybody out on all of their upkeeps.
My favorite thing about the Stranger Things release was not the people freaking out about it, but specifically about Phoenix, Sculptors Phoenix, and Gustav freaking out about the fact that they could just Ranger Captain every turn. They were like, we can't let this happen. It's too much.
That was because I specifically remember getting DMs from Phoenix about this being like, this card's not okay.
Yeah.
11 is not the problem
legitimately
card.
Freaking out, legitimately wigging out. Like, I don't want to play against Ranger Captain multiple times.
Right. But for a number of reasons, I backed away from that aspect of the.
I think the list as is a lot less cute than that, and I think that's probably going to be better for you in the long run.
Right. Yeah. Part of what I really like about it, though, is just like it just layers very well with itself, which I really like. I am curious, just looking at your list, is how good has Pure Steel Paladin been? Because I was unimpressed with it, but I'm curious how you felt about it.
So Pure Steel Paladin is useful for really two things. One is if you do need to equip one of your equipment to something prior to combat for whatever reason, not necessarily Helm of the Host, but you want to, I don't know, it comes up. That's a useful ability to be able to do that for 0. Okay. The original the original intent that's not in there anymore is the Bloodforged Battle Axe.
Yeah.
So because unlike SRAM, the Pure Steel Paladin is triggered by equipment entering the battlefield. So basically what happens is
hilarious.
Bloodforged Battle Axe will double itself every time, and you draw a card for every single copy that comes into play. So that very, very quickly, exponentially, in fact, goes out of hand. So that was the main reason for having it.
Okay.
I think I literally cut it from my list this morning before recording. So it was almost in there for me as well.
It's just like it's one of those things where I guess in my list is less like Hammer Time and more like Blue White X Control. And so like I'm only playing, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. Wait, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. So 5 if you include Helm of the Host equipment in my equipment center deck. Now, granted, I also have, what is it, like 4 or 5 tutors for the equipment. So like I'm getting the ones that I want.
Another angle that I had was, like I said, with Oswald Fiddlebender.
Yeah.
You could, you take one, you take a Mox and then you basically pod it into an equipment draw card.
Right.
And then if you have a means of untapping him, which I used to have in the list, then you could, pod away that equipment for another equipment, draw another card. And, it's just a lot of little incremental advantage that adds up over time.
I think also a big distinction here is that like you're on blue, Cal, right? So like our card advantage is a lot harder to get just naturally going through the deck. It's not like we have Tymna in the command zone or anything like that. So we have to kind of like take alternate means for something like that, as opposed to you get Ristic and Mystic and yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, that is very fair. And that is partially why I like if you look at this list, what is it? It's 38% blue, 29% white, 13% red. It is very much a blue-white deck that has red cards in it. You. What'd you say?
So that doesn't sound like you at all.
Yeah, no. The way this deck kind of evolved really is it kind of evolved out of the Ojutai, Dragonlord Ojutai deck that I was playing for a while. And this was, Arden's really good because I was playing that in the 99 of Ojutai. And I was like, man, Arden's really good. What is a big beater?
If only there was another 5-mana flying card advantage engine.
that also gives me access to red. And I was like, hey, Crom, come here. Getting to play Dockside. I mean, it's effectively the same deck, right? Like you just you just get access to Dockside and Ragavan, which is totally poggers. Ian, back to you. What are some key cards in your list?
Key cards, I guess so to understand the list, I think, first of all, like you go to the artifacts, we have 22 of them. A lot of those decisions are definitely informed by the fact that, not a lot of them, a good amount of decisions are informed that we have Urza Saga to be able to fetch a lot of stuff in the deck, like a lot of things in this deck.
Right.
We have, I guess it's for this deck, the key cards are more key archetypes, right? So we need our like pieces to get going. We have an aggressive amount of stacks. Like as someone who plays a lot of stacks, this is a lot of stacks. Not only the Rule of Law effects, but Tanglewire, Trinisphere, Containment Priest, Grafdiggers, Linvala. I think not Curse Totem because I have some activated abilities. But just a very, very heavy density of these things. And so the idea is really to like slam as many of these pieces that we don't care about as possible. And then to get kind of to smacking and or to Godoing. So obviously our combo is super important. Any of the unconditional tutors are very important. You mentioned Search for Glory. It's a great way to get Godo. It's a great way to get a bunch of legendary permanents in the deck. Jete. Very interesting legendary equipment that's actually really good here, and people are probably going to flame the comments for is Lucille, being the bat of one Negan from The Walking Dead. The downside of that card is its quip cost, but giving any creature +2/0 menace and the fact that it makes a person sacrifice a creature when it just attacks, and you get to make a 2/2. Like that's just so much value for basically what you're paying is 2 mana when you have your commander out. Yeah. So you pay 2 mana, you get evasion, get a power buff, make them sacrifice the thing, and it creates bodies.
Yeah.
In a situation in which you're like trying to stacks out the game, that is an insane amount of value.
As somebody who's played a lot of Arden, like you will have your commander on the board on turn 1 pretty often.
Yeah, I was a little surprised you guys weren't playing Bloodforged Battle Axe. I feel like that's just so good with Arden.
So go ahead, Gobble.
I was going to say I originally was, but I removed it just to kind of focus more on either the pieces that were kind of like instantaneously turning a threat, like for instance, hammer or belt. Those things are, right off the bat, they're giving something +10/+10. Or the things that provide cover. So Sword of Fire and Ice or Commander's, it's the equipment that costs 1 that gives it protection from whatever is not in your color identity. Yeah, Commander's Plate, that kind of stuff. Bloodfire Battle Axe is great because it, multiplies. But I mean, really, it's like, okay, if I wait, if I swing with it and hit for 3 turns, I can get it to be as strong as hammer is when it first comes down.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just one of those things where the efficiency just wasn't, what I needed in that space, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think for me, it really came down to card slots.
Yeah.
For me, like I'm playing the least amount of artifacts, I believe, of everybody.
Mm-hmm. No, you and Cobbler are tied, I believe.
Are we? Okay. Well, the vast majority of the deck is comprised of removal and counter spells. And the reasoning behind that is basically not letting your opponents get to resolve their spells. And like, I think people are like, oh, counter magic just really isn't that good. You can't answer everything. Correct. Which is why like I said earlier, you kind of have to be a little clever because you have to really know what the thing is you need to counter, which is the same in blue-white control in Modern, right? Like you don't just sit there and say, no, not until like the late game when you've got like 90 counter spells in your hand after you've, flipped over Search for Azcanta. But like the difference here is the motivation is not to land the threat and then immediately attach something to it. It is to land the threat and then use the equipment to do crowd control. And I don't think like Sword of Hearth and Home layers really well with like Gilded Drake, and Helm of the Host layers really well with Gilded Drake actually as well. There's all sorts of things like that, like Sword of Fire and Ice, Jitte, Skull Clamp. I've kind of discussed Skull Clamp already, where you kind of are using your equipment in a more, I guess, defensive way because I'm like dealing with my opponent's creatures, but you're like offensively using them, if that makes any sense whatsoever. So like you're aggressively using them against your opponents. There were living weapons in this at one point. I have been taking them in and out for a variety of reasons. And it's been kind of like, try maybe an extra rule of law. Batterskull's really good in this deck. And Cauldron Complier is also really good in this deck. And it just felt like those felt more powerful than Bloodforged Battle Axe. Especially when you come down and you just activate the ability of like Stoneforge Biscuit and you just lay down a giant creature with, ability soup. And, so that is one thing that is in the deck sometimes. It depends on my mood. But Bloodforged Battle Axe I just didn't have space for and didn't feel like it made as big as an impact as some of the other stuff I could be playing.
Yeah, makes sense. One other card I want to shout out.
Oh, I'm sorry. Ian, you had mentioned before that Winota was a very late addition to your list.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Have you goldfished it since putting Winota in?
No.
And I'm asking that specifically because of Grafdigger's Cage and Containment Priest.
Yep.
Would you revise things, or would you kind of accept that internal inconsistency?
Yeah, maybe. So Containment Priest was, I think, literally the last thing I added to this deck. So like, I think I'm okay with the Grafdigger's Cage anti-synergy specifically, because I think Grafdiggers is very good against almost everything in the format. Maybe Containment Priest doesn't need to be there. Like, that feels like an unnecessary addition. I think Containment Priest is a good card, but I think I would rather have Winota than Containment Priest in the deck. And I think the smart choice is to choose between one of the two.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I also did realize this like halfway through the recording, and I was like, I'll bring that up at some point.
Cobble beat you to it.
Yep. One thing I was going to say was I think Tanglewire is actually really interesting in a deck full of equipment because of the fact that equipment don't care if they're tapped or untapped. Yeah. Same thing thinking about cards like Urza, you know what I mean, or other synergies in which equipment being tapped is actually an advantage. Tanglewire is obviously the one that like kind of fits with what we're doing the most like seamlessly, but it is an interesting thought process to kind of think about like, what can I mess with in this that would turn like an equipment into something I can use, and also either an anti-Tanglewire piece, or with Urza like a Mox. Like, you know, there's some interesting thought processes there.
When we look at your list, Cobble, you've got like a lot of different stuff going on. You know, your decks are notoriously complex and interesting. What are some of the key cards in this list?
I would say first and foremost, Rule of Law and all of the Rule of Law variants. I think I'm running all of them that are in the colors, right? Yeah. And we had talked before about the different flavors of Rule of Law, where there's the aggressive mulligan until you have a Rule of Law in your opening hand versus Rule of Law being part of your portfolio. Mm-hmm. And this is leaning a little bit closer to the aggressively try to find a Rule of Law to have in your opening hand. If you've got an opening hand where you're able to, you know, get some other types of hate onto the battlefield early, then I think that that's perfectly fine as well. Like a turn 1 Drannith Magistrate is not bad at all. And it's there's flexibility, but most of the kind of what we want to be doing is going to be predicated around taking opponents off of their desired game environment. Right. So, because we know that we're not going to race people. So what we need to do is we need to get people to be playing by our rules. And in order to do that, you know, we got to get Rule of Law effects onto the board and try to keep them onto the board. Yeah. In addition to the Rule of Law, I would say Birthing Pod, obviously. There's a lot of kind of Blood Pod, I would say, feelings that are happening here, where, you know, once you've got, you know, a dork on the board or something like that, and you have an extra dork or whatever, you know, turning those dorks into Drannith Magistrates and Aethersworn Canonists or Stoneforge Mystics is very useful, and being able to kind of walk your creatures up the ladder to get the things that are most impactful. It's very, very useful. So, you know, maybe you got your Stoneforge onto the battlefield and you know, it triggered, and, you know, maybe it doesn't have a whole lot of use anymore because you're not going to be drawing into a lot of equipment. You know, being able to convert that into a ranger, captain of Eos, or Yisan, or a combat celebrant, or a Archon of Ameria. It's having the flexibility to do all that stuff without actually casting anything is really important to the deck, to be able to just continuously be able to respond to the changing circumstances of the board's texture.
Being able to use one of your dorks to pod into a Stoneforge Mystic is honestly the hottest thing I can imagine. And then you can use the equipability on your next turn, equip it to the thing you want, and then you can still pod away the Stoneforge Mystic, go get something else.
Archon of Ameria.
Yeah, like that's really sweet. I love that line.
Right. And I mean, obviously, Tana is a it should go without saying, but Tana's very, very important to the deck just because she creates saprolings and like what you want to be doing. I mean, you want to have Tana on the battlefield and you want to put a Colossus Hammer on her. You want to swing and get 12 saprolings, and then you want to play Winota the next turn and attack with all the saprolings and get 12 Winota triggers. That's living the dream that you want to be doing with this deck.
It's really cool because I think this is the first deck that I've really seen people use Tana in a meaningful way.
Right.
Because like most of the time you see Tana paired with anything, really, it feels like Tana is just there because it has red and green, right? Like this feels like you're really using Tana to like her max potential.
Right. There's also, I mean, we've got Skull Clamp.
I forgot Tana has trample. That's gross.
Yeah, that's huge.
Disgusting.
That is huge.
Indeed.
Well, because normally it's a 2/2 with trample. Who gives a crap?
Because I was sitting here thinking, I was like, man, you really like people just get in the way of the Colossus Hammer creature because it doesn't give a trample. And I'm like, wait a second, this has trample. Excuse me.
That's by far Tana's probably like the best partner to wear it because trample and the fact that Colossus Hammer removes flying from other stuff. So it's probably the best partner to be able to wear that card.
Yeah.
What's also nice about this particular pairing is that normally in Winota lists, you need to very, very carefully calibrate the human to non-human ratio of your creatures. But because of the fact that both of my partners that are in the command zone are non-humans, and one of them generates non-humans, that frees things up to be able to have a higher human density in the 99 or the 98, because you know that you're kind of always going to have access to things that are going to be triggering Winota.
Yeah. And
you know that if you can increase the density of humans, that means that you will connect more often with those Winota triggers. So it helps the deck along quite a bit.
God, that's so sexy. That's beautiful. God.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk for a very long time that if Winota was Naya, that card would be, despite it already being kind of fundamentally a broken Magic card, it would be insane.
And I mean, it goes without saying that, Tana does very well with Skull Clamp.
Yeah.
Tana does very well with Toski and with Orin Frostfang.
Yep.
So there's just kind of layers upon layers of how she is kind of central to the game. And
this is probably my favorite like Tana deck, period. I think I've never seen Tana like used as well as it is used when you put Arden in the other command zone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like, because it's even in like Blood Pod in the Tymna Tana lists, like it does layer with Tymna, but I don't think it layers nearly as well, right? No, this is just this is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
I really like the direction you went with that. As we look at some of the more techie options that are in your lists, Ian, what is some of the hot spice? What's some of that?
Okay.
Maybe cayenne's a bad thing because that shows how wide I am. What's some of the spice you're throwing in there?
Or is it the ghost pepper? Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see here. We already talked about Search for Glory, great card. Urza Saga is stupidly powerful in this deck.
Yes.
It has such good synergy. Weathered Wayfarer is I think pretty solid in a deck where you want to get Urza Saga, and
Urza Saga tutor
on Cavern of Souls. Yes, I am on Cavern of Souls as well. So making your creatures uncounterable, specifically Godo, cough, seems really good. Let's see here. As I already talked about Lucille. Lucille's absolutely insane. Specifically, this one deck. Cathar Commando, I think, is just really strong when you're so going insane on these rule of law effects. It's good if you don't have green for that type of permanent base removal.
So is Expedition Map just getting Urza Saga, or is it also getting Cavern?
Urza Saga, Cavern of Souls.
Okay.
Mostly Urza Saga. I think Urza Saga is just kind of maybe
broken magic
I've been
card.
Watching too many people play Hammer Time or whatever, but I think Urza Saga is really good in a list that works around it, right? But when it works really, really well. And this is a list where it works really, really well. Just having the option to get Bloodforge Battle Axe, Colossus Hammer, or Grafdigger's Cage, just 3 of the potential options there are already enough for me to be oh wow, that's crazy. And even Mana Crypt, right? It does enough to accelerate you. I think Kunoros is a really good card in this list. We don't really care about our graveyard. It has the right amount of evasion where combat becomes very troublesome for your opponent. And if you're suiting it up with a bunch of equipment, it can kind of get out of hand really fast. And that was definitely one of those cards where they're well, if the meta warps around graveyards, then Kunoros might be a pretty good card. And now the meta's a little bit warped around graveyards, so I think it's a pretty good card.
It's so one of the things that I think is really interesting about your list is had I done Arden with Vial Smasher, my first thought would have been to do obviously the Godo combo as your win con, but do a reanimator package so that you could do it quickly, if that makes sense. That was because I've thought about it before. And so when I saw you were doing Mardu, I was oh, maybe you did that. And then you went Hate Bear City. Did you just not think about that? Or was that very intentional? You want to be playing a stacks list?
I didn't think about that. But that being said, I can't imagine that archetype, despite being a faster version of what we're doing here. The things it would lose stacks wise, I don't think make it fast enough that it could ever erase the scary things of the format. And I think Arden Godo is an attractive combo to me personally because of the fact that it breaks parity on a ridiculous amount of stacks.
Right.
And so kind of going and creating this halfway deck in which you still can't play interaction, and you're the more things you play Entomb and Reanimate and stuff like that, the less likely you are to want to play things like Rule of Law. And then suddenly you're losing Grafdigger's Cages and your Rule of Law and basically saying, hey, opponents, I can't do anything. Right. So what's happening on this board here? So that would be my intention. It would just be or my impression of that would be I don't really see what it's doing that would be above and beyond to push it into the cEDH realm.
Right.
For what it's worth, I originally had Goblin Welder and Goblin Engineer in the first iteration of the list.
Yeah.
And was running the living weapon creature, non-creatures that we talked about a little bit earlier. And those allow you to kind of get around they allow you to make Grafdigger's Cage asymmetric because they're living weapons, but they're not creatures. So they can enter the battlefield from the graveyard and then become creatures or, become equipped to a germ. or whatever. And being able to turn a treasure token into a Cauldra complete is very much better than having to like do all the reanimation stuff or casting it or whatever.
Right.
That said, and it doesn't require black because you can do all that stuff in red. It's not necessary. There's enough other things that can get you all of the value without the that more smoothly, where these other things I think are a little bit too bumpy to be consistent.
Yeah.
And I also think like when you're not playing card advantage in the command zone, there is a much higher burden of what your cards need to be able to do. The impact of each individual card has to be higher, or you need to be playing a deck full of card advantage engines. So when you go into the reanimate, I think there's a reason that like every reanimator deck in our format isn't blue. And I think it's obviously black because you need black, but but like I think there's a reason that they tend to be that, and that's because you need to be able to like you have your Entomb, you have your reanimation piece, you have protection for it on top of all of that, and I think you need all of those separate pieces, and to be able to keep up with the game and like be able to fight off countermeasures, be able to fight off win attempts, any of those things. I think it takes a lot of card advantage to be able to play that strategy, which you can't get in Mardu with this deck.
Right.
But Tim, no, the command zone's a little different, but
yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
I don't really have any tech in my list, I guess. We were talking about this pre-show, and I'm like, I don't know how to say it. Maybe the most techie piece is Winds of Abandon, which I've been yelling about for a while. But even then, it fits into the deck really well. So it's like, it's one of those things where I'm like, I don't know that I have any spicy tech. It's just, here's Arden and Crom and 98 good cards that work with this and counter spells and just a bunch of good cards, classic Callahan magic. Cobble, when we look at yours, some very, some of the tech that you go into it, I did see that you had Basilisk Collar in the list, and that explains. I was staring at the Goblin Sharpshooter in your list, and I was like, what is this there for? And then I realized. So explain some of the tech that you're running in your deck here.
Right. A lot of this isn't necessarily tech. It's just stuff that might not be immediately apparent when you first glance at the list, and is just kind of little nuances that help you to get the most out of the pieces that are available to you. So yes, there's definitely the Sharpshooter and Basilisk Collar combo, because the Sharpshooter has Death Touch. Anything that it deals a damage to is going to die, and it will be able to untap, so that you can do an asymmetric board wipe perpetually as long as you want, and you gain life for each damage that you do as well. The Goblin Sharpshooter was originally in there because I was doing Kiki Jiki in the original iteration, and was just one of those things that was, part of the equation. But the Sharpshooter does enough work even without Basilisk Collar, given the density of hate bears and dorks that we have in the metagame right now, to warrant hanging around. Outland Liberator is very similar. Ian was talking about Cathar Commando. Outland Liberator is kind of like Cathar Commando as at the floor, because it's a werewolf, and werewolves do very well in Winota lists that have Rule of Law, because it's a human, so it can be found with Winota, and then once you're able to get it to flip, then no one is going to cast more than one spell per turn, so it will stay in the werewolf form kind of perpetually. And the flip side of Outland Liberator destroys an enchantment or an artifact whenever it attacks. So it's a significantly stronger effect.
I feel like dipping into Naya with the Winota strategy lets you get way more of like utility out of the werewolf creatures.
Yes,
it's an insane amount for sure.
I still think that Outland Liberator is probably like the sweet spot. I think it's the best one.
Mm-hmm.
And
what did you consider Avabrook Caretaker at all?
I did, but so there's only so many six drops that you can actually hit.
It's such a meme. Right. No, I get it. I get the card. I feel like Rebel and Pongo have been talking about this card. And I'm like, it's 6 freaking mana, y'all. Like, it's so much.
and I mean, I have 3 6 drops in this list.
Yeah.
And you know, that comes with, you know, great trepidation. But really there's a very intentional purpose for each of these 3. None of them are there kind of whimsically. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Well, I can talk about that now. So we talked about, reanimation for Godo to be able to more deterministically make the Godo combo happen. With survival of the fittest and the 30 creatures that we have in the list, it's very easy to have a dork activate survival twice and throw the dork in the yard and get Godo, throw Godo in the yard and get loyal retainers, play the retainers, sacrifice them, put Godo onto the battlefield, Godo triggers, goes and gets Helm, and you attack and you win. So
retainers for Godo. Okay. I was wondering why retainers was in this list.
Real sick.
Yep, that's pretty cool.
But I mean, also there's plenty of other, retainers just as a means of getting back something that was important that you lost, like, Kadama or whatever. Also very, very useful. Sigarda's Aid is a great card. It allows your auras and your equipment to be cast as though they had flash. And whenever you have an equipment enter the battlefield, you can just attach it to something as part of entering the battlefield. That is very useful for, for efficiency, being able to cast things and not have to worry about the equip costs if for whatever reason someone's dealt with your Arden, but more importantly, being able to break parity with rule of law. And, because you when you're under the rule of law, you have to kind of prioritize, how am I going to get this important hate bear onto the battlefield, but also get this important equipment onto the battlefield as well. And being able to just put all those equipment in with flash is it frees you up to have much better throughput and be able to break that parity.
Right.
It doesn't dawn on people very often, but if you put a Colossus Hammer on Esper Sentinel, people will generally not pay they typically don't pay the 11.
No kidding. So I have a question for both of you. As I'm looking at everybody's lists, is none of us put any auras in our lists. And I'm curious if anybody, I know why I didn't, but I'm curious what your guys' thoughts were. If you considered any, what the thought process was on that.
There were multiple that I considered. One was Curse of Opulence, which is an aura for
the red
one, curse. Right. It's a single mana that basically generates a treasure, but I think they call it a gold, or is it actually a treasure?
No, it's a treasure.
No, it's a gold.
Is it?
It's a gold.
I'm thinking of the new one. Curse of Hospitality.
Right. But anyway, it's a 1 mana aura that you can stick on an opponent and attack them. And then whenever anybody else attacks them, you continue to get gold. And it was one of those things where it it helped a lot when I had a Fiddlebender in the list to be able to, go
sack it away. Yeah.
Sack it away and go and throw one of the equipment onto the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
But its usefulness was, not huge. I have less need for ramp, especially since we have access to Gaia's Cradle, than we do for consistently putting threats onto the battlefield that can either remove opponents' pieces or that can create, stacks effects that make the enemies have more challenges. Instill energy also was one of the things that I put on originally, just because it allows you to untap it gives a haste-ish ability, which confuses everybody because instill energy does not give haste. Even if the printing of the card that you're using says equipped or enchanted creature has haste, that's not true. It can attack as though it has haste, but it can't be activated the first turn that it comes down.
Interesting.
that is really irritating.
It's the most unintuitive wording of all time.
Right. So I had that. I had originally put it on there so that I could attack with certain creatures the turn that they came down, but also have the ability to, if Yi-San came down or Oswald Fiddlebender came down or something like that, being able to, activate them twice. Those were useful abilities. But again, it's one of those things where if that creature dies, then, well, okay, that aura is lost, where equipment doesn't have that liability. Yep. I had keen sense for a similar reason, and for a similar reason, it eventually just got shuffled away because equipment's better.
Yep. So podium soapbox moment about auras. So first of all, I mean, there's not enough auras that are like, I would say, pushed to be in a position where you can really abuse them in the way that we'd want to. The other thing is like, so for example, Skull Clamp is a removal equipment that you can use over and over again. But right. Even if you wanted to use a more removal based aura, there are answers, things like, Kenrith, Starksteel, stuff like that. But the other ones that are more common and more popular tend to be like the -X ones, which you can't get back because then they just go right to the graveyard. So like Darksteel is probably the one that is, okay, it's a removal piece once, but then if you move it, it's suddenly, first of all, it takes up your whole Arden activation for the turn, and it's just getting one thing removed as opposed to another. And yeah, there are some synergies there, but like not enough. The other thing is that Arden allows you to gain advantage by not paying mana into the equip costs. When you're playing an aura, you don't have that. Like you are not gaining any mana advantage by using auras with Arden, unless specifically there is an aura that says like when this is enchanting one thing, it does one thing at the beginning of the turn or something like that, and then it would jump over to another one. But a lot of the auras don't do that, and the equipments have that stickiness, that redundancy, and have their equip cost reduced. Yeah, which is why you see us talking about cards like, for example, when I was talking about Lucille or talking about Colossus Hammer, right? Because that's a 1 mana spell that normally has a 10 mana equip investment, or the belts that you were talking about as well, Cobblepott. These small investment, big payoff equipments are way better with Arden. Yeah. But auras are the same. There's no cost benefit. There's none of that.
This is something that I've kind of thought about a lot is I know in Whimsy's version of what was it? Of Dragon Lord Ojutai, he plays Sentinelize, and I think that's the only one he plays for that. And I think it makes sense in that because it gives like Ojutai vigilance. But the issue I kept
can be rebought.
Yeah, and I think that's where like if I were to consider one, it'd be like Sentinelize. And when I kept looking for potential auras to play, I specifically were like, if they have flashback, or if they have none would have flashback, I guess. If they had escape on them, And none really did that outside of Sentinel Eyes that I thought were worth playing. And
it's like that and like Griff's Boon, basically.
Right. And part of my biggest thing is so I'm only playing 10 creatures, so I'm not moving things around a lot, if that makes sense.
Yep.
I'm doing it when I want to equip a particular creature or if I want to snipe somebody's creatures. Right. And using that Arden ability on something that was not gaining me advantage felt like a waste of an Arden ability. So
agreed.
There was just nothing. Like I looked at some of the curses and then I was just like, I feel like that's just going to make me like the table enemy if I play too many curses, or if I, you know, like eventually they'll figure out that they have to deal with me because I'm the person who controls the curse. So it's like,
I feel like the only curse really worth playing in cEDH that I've even seen is the red one. And that's just because it's a 1 mana thing. It refunds itself. And then that's also, I've seen that in like Corvold, which is like treasure synergies, sure, or gold synergies in that sense. But
like,
you know,
I could see curses, but it's like the same thing is, let's say they kill that player before you have a chance to get back around to move it off of. You know, you're suddenly without it and you have no way of playing it again. So it's just, I think the aura side of it is the weakest part of it, but I was curious to see if you guys thought of any or considering any.
For a while, I justified the auras that I was running because I was running Sigarda's Aid, so I could cast them with flash and, you know, not lose my tempo with Rule of Law.
Right.
And but then again, that kind of requires you know, that's predicated on you having Sigarda's Aid. And I don't want to go and look for Sigarda's Aid. It's just, it gives you value when you find it, but you don't want to have that as a crutch to be able to enable other cards in your deck.
Right.
Agreed.
Yeah.
The one last thing that I wanted to get in is Kadama and why Kadama.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
So we've got multiple ways to get Kadama onto the battlefield. We've got the Loyal Retainers. We've got Eldritch Evolution, got Finale, you know, those kind of things. And we're not hurting for mana. If you can have Tana on the battlefield and Gaia's Cradle, you're never going to hurt for mana. But because of the Rule of Law, you know, we're always looking for different ways that we can take our Rule of Law and break parity. Kadama, when you've got Tana on the battlefield, Kadama will trigger for all of those Saprolings that come into play. So if you've got, you know, one of the big draw engines, either the Squirrel or Zav, or in Frostfang, and you happen to have a whole bunch of, you know, cards in hand, you draw a whole bunch of cards and then put the Saprolings onto the battlefield. Kadama will see those Saprolings and you can then put all of those lands onto the battlefield untapped. Yisan lets you double up because, you know, you go and you find a creature, put it onto the battlefield, and then you put something from your hand onto the battlefield as well. And Winota's the same way. You know, Winota triggers some number of times because you've got, you know, Tana on the battlefield and you swing with 12 Saprolings. Every one of those creatures that enters the battlefield, if you've got Kadama in play, is also going to allow you to put something from your hand onto the battlefield. All of these things are allowing you to skirt the negative impact and create an asymmetry with the Rule of Law, which we're already designed to get the most out of Rule of Law. And when you can act as if Rule of Law is not even on the battlefield, it is hugely impactful.
Right. Very interesting to see all the directions that we've kind of taken these, but to really dig deep into that here as we go into the next part is looking at the deck comparisons. So starting off with the artifact section, stuff that we all have are Chrome Mox, Helm of the Host, Jewel Lotus, Mana Crypt, Mox Diamond, Skull Clamp, Soul Ring, Sword of Fire and Ice in Umezawa's Jite. And I feel like it's pretty easy to explain why we all have those cards in the deck, right? Like those all kind of make sense.
Fast mana, good artifacts, or good equipment. For sure.
Ian and I both have Grim Monolith, Mana Vault. You and Cobble both have Colossus Hammer and Conqueror's Flail, Lotus Petal. And Cobble and I both have Sword of Hearth and Home. What was for you, Ian, not like the decision to not play Sword of Hearth and Home?
I don't know why you guys are playing it.
Are you kidding?
I have no idea why you guys are playing that card. No idea.
So with me, it's absurd. So you get Gilded Drake out, you attack with literally any creature, it deals combat damage, you flicker your Gilded Drake, steal another creature.
Okay. So like Gilded Drake, Dockside, Stoneforge.
Yeah. Like it's incredibly powerful. And then
I just don't think
I imagine you have some ETB effects you wouldn't mind doubling up on.
Exactly. It's for Stoneforge, Imperial Recruiter, Ranger Captain of Eos, Recruiter of the Guard. There's just Godo.
Right.
There's a whole bunch of things where being able to swing and flicker one of those ETBs is going to give you a lot of value.
Yeah. And I think I have 2 or 3 cards that flicker and give me value in my entire list. So I'm
that's fair.
And with Kadama, you can swing.
That's very true.
And you flicker your recruiter and stack the triggers because the recruiter came into the battlefield, and then put the thing that it found right onto the battlefield without casting it.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at the creature list. So I only have 10 creatures. So the stuff we share, everybody has Aven Mind Sensor, Draenith Magistrate, Esper Sentinel, Aethersworn Canonist, Godo, and Stoneforge Mystic.
And Archon of Emeria.
Yeah. And Archon of Emeria. Sorry, I guess I scrolled down slightly too far on the spreadsheet. So I got to have a conversation with you, Cobblepott. Why in God's name are you not playing Dockside?
Because it's a stacks list. And at the end of the day, I don't need the mana. So the original iteration of the list had Ragavan. It had Dockside. It even had Smothering Tithe. But through iteration, those 3 pieces were less and less necessary, especially once Oswald Fiddlebender left the list as well. It's one of those things where mana, and this could be anecdotal, but in testing, the choice between having Dockside in hand versus having Archon of Emeria in hand, or having Winota in hand or something like that. So let's say that we're under rule of law and I've got a Dockside and I've got Winota. Which one do I want to cast? It's like, well, if you cast the Dockside, that will in the future allow me to cast other things, but now I've committed my turn to casting Dockside and that's it, versus casting Winota and then attacking and getting several more pieces onto the battlefield. It's one of those things where there's a point where, because I can't really get that much value out of recurring it, because I'm not doing, besides the Sword of Hearth and Home, I can't bounce my Dockside. I can't clone my Dockside. I can't reanimate my Dockside. So there's a point where the Dockside is like a lotus petal. And it's just something where you're under a rule of law and you don't want to waste your cast on something that is just going to get you a resource that you already have plenty of. And I know that people are going to flame me and go ahead, bring it. But that is my rationalization for not having it.
I guess when you compare it to like your engines of your deck, right, then that logic checks out. But like when you compare it to something like a Goblin Sharpshooter or like Basilisk Collar, I don't know that any of those pieces or like, I don't know, I could go through and pick like the cards that are like not the main parts of what your deck's trying to do here.
Sure.
And to me, like a card like Dockside does way more work than any of this stuff like that.
So the Sharpshooter has remained in because it's one of the reliable ways for removing other permanents that I don't have access to Mayhem Devil, and I don't have access to Chatterfang or to what's the Tiefling?
Tiefling?
The Tiefling that
Grim Hireling. Yeah.
Grim Hireling.
But you're playing you're playing swords already. I could easily see you being on something like Path or a number of other like actual removal spells.
Yeah. Again, those require casting. It's one of those where trying to focus on getting value without having to spend your cast for the turn.
I think my only issue with your rationale, I think I get what you're saying. I think my only issue with it is it assumes you have mana, which in my experience isn't always how it works, especially in decks where your artifact count is a little bit lower on like your mana rock count. Because your mana rock count is pretty slim. You're running 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rocks and on 29 lands. And I guess you're playing dorks, but like I think that your argument makes sense on the axis that it assumes that you have mana available to do things. But I think that the advantage of Dockside is like the advantage to Dockside, in my opinion, is especially in early game acceleration where you don't have Rule of Law out. You are, you have 3 mana and you don't have Rule of Law in hand and you're able to slam down your Tana. I think that it enables enough of your other strategies that I think I still think it's worth including, but I understand your rationale. And
like we talked before about the different flavors of Rule of Law, we are aggressively trying to get a Rule of Law early, turn 1 if possible, in which case the efficacy of having Dockside under those circumstances, the value that it produces is less because you have to prioritize.
Also triggers Winota though too. Also has that it serves. It can wear more hats than makes mana.
Right.
I don't know. I get what you're saying. I was just very curious because I was looking at your list and I was very surprised to not see Dockside.
Right.
So I'm sure people will have opinions on that.
Oh, I'm sure they will.
People on the internet with strong opinions. Come on.
I can't imagine.
So looking at your list now, Ian, you and Cobble are both playing Mother of Runes, but you're also playing Giver of Runes. What's kind of the thought process? Because I've considered them myself. But what's the thought process behind really kind of going, hammer time on us?
What really sucks is when you have an Arden ability and you target a creature and your opponent goes, in response, I will cast a Chain of Vapor targeting that creature. Or, for example, you have an opponent locked out because you have a Ranger Captain on board and they go, on the end step before my turn, I'm going to bounce your Ranger Captain. And it's nice to go, I'm going to tap my creature. suck it. I even in Winota, there was a while where I like wasn't playing Mother of Runes because I was like, it's one of those things where it's like flipping it sucks. It does. And it does. It does suck when you flip it over. But because it doesn't do anything that turn, right? And it's, the mentality of immediacy, right? Like, what does that do? However, it's such a powerful effect. The combo is creature based, right? Like I'm playing a thing that will grab a Cavern of Souls or an Urza Saga because of that, right? And being able to protect it on multiple axes, because people are playing a lot of bounce removal, right? That is, no matter what they are doing as far as like things like swords or whatever path, they're not usually playing those things, but they are almost always playing something that will bounce your creature. Right. The reason why like Godo doesn't have an insane win rate, despite it being a very good deck, is because people can bounce stuff and they can interact in ways that aren't just counter magic on the stack. So no, they can't counter something like a Godo on the stack, but sometimes they can just use a Chain Vapor or an Alchemist Retrieval or something like that to get rid of a permanent that's important. So especially when you're playing stacks, being able to protect your stacks is definitely something you need to be able to do. And coming down early, usually before the Rule of Laws, makes it a much more attractive option because now you're playing it before you can be limited to one spell a turn, and therefore the fact that it's so small and so cheap and doesn't take up your whole turn to do in like the mid game it seems pretty strong. Right. And it also makes a lot of hands much more keepable, right? Like if you're relying on a single stacks piece, being able to protect that single stacks piece and stop your opponents from like popping off is really strong.
Right.
And I'm not on Giver of Runes because I'm on Sylvan Safekeeper.
Right. That makes sense.
Which provides a lot of the same cover without needing to have haste, but it doesn't allow you to gain protection to be able to swing through and not be blockable. So it's a trade-off, but I have one of each flavor.
Yeah.
And Sylvan Safekeeper is completely unexplainably a human. Instead of an elf.
Yeah. Which it always helps with the cute Winota synergies. Yeah, the amount of things that are just like accidentally human. So cool. It's just it's a popular archetype, right? It's very easy to make things that are just like, oh yeah, this is a human with a sword, but they do life magic, or this is a human that's a rogue, or and now all these things come together and you're like, there's a lot of humans in Magic.
There really, really are. I'm noticing that you've got Phyrexian Revoker.
Yes. That is a card that I played in Winota, and I think when I was building this list, I used Winota as a reference point. It could easily be like a Pithing Needle because of Urza Saga, and I was thinking about that when I was looking at the deck, but having a stacks piece that you can put equipment on seems just in general just like a little bit better. So I think, the synergy between Urza Saga and Pithing Needle is just a little bit beaten out by the fact that I can stop something like a Thrasios and then also have it be a 10/10 at some point.
Potentially, yeah. It's interesting because it's just looking at my list. I feel like my list is just so pedestrian compared to your guys's. Like, we come down here and we look at the enchantments, and my big differences was I'm playing Mystic Remora, Ristic Study, and Counterbalance. Oh boy.
Ooh, spicy.
Really hitting on the edges of what we can do in EDH, guys. But really looking at the enchantments, all three of us are playing Deafening Silence. All three of us are playing Rule of Law. And then Ian and I are both playing Fighter class in Rest in Peace. And then, Cobble, you get to play, some of the good green stuff like Carpet of Flowers and Survival and Sylvan Library. Ian, so what's your thoughts on Blind Obedience? I know that people have a lot of different opinions on Blind Obedience. What's your take on how this has been for you?
So, as we kind of mentioned a couple times, going through my deck, the amount of stacks in this deck is too damn high. But no, like the idea behind it is just like play everything that stops what your opponents are trying to do. I play 22 artifacts. So not getting cucked by a dockside is pretty important. And Blind Obedience helps with that a lot. Yes, they can untap and do it next turn, but that gives you like that. The tempo advantage is huge. Also, this morning I was at 99 cards because I had cut a card at one point and forgot to put one in. And I said, you know what? Blind Obedience seems really good. So that is why it's in there.
It's the
and
Charles
I had Blind
classic.
Obedience in my list until the very last moment. So that was one of the last cuts that I had in there. So it may well come back.
Yeah.
Cigar is really interesting when you're playing a lot more of the like utility and big mana or big power and toughness setting artifacts or like equipment.
I definitely talked about it before the cast.
Yeah, like being able to cast like Hammer Time for 1 mana on someone's end step does seem like really good.
Or in the middle of combat.
Yeah.
Like, just using that as a combat trick is pretty cool.
And have it just equip as part of entering the battlefield.
Yeah. I think like if I'm going to make a switch after the cast is done recording, it's probably taking out Containment Piece because of the anti-synergy we talked about earlier and probably putting in Sigarda's Aid because I think it works really well. Like I'm already just mostly devoted to sorcery speed stuff apart from a couple of cards. So it feels like a pretty safe switch in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at the instant suite. So Ian has 7. Cobble has 11. I have 29. So there's no similarities between our 3 lists.
No.
The big similarity is okay. That's not true. There is a similarity.
You're not on deflecting.
We're
Sweat?
all playing Enlightened Tutor, and we're all playing deflecting. I should be playing deflecting.
Oh yeah, you are.
Yeah.
Sweat. Okay.
So all 3 of us are on deflecting slot and Enlightened Tutor. Silence. We're all on silence, and you're not on Pyroblast, Ian. Or Reb.
I've gone on this tangent too many times on this podcast. I feel like I've been occasionally playing Red Blast again, but like I'm super low on the blast right now. Not that I've had any tournaments to play since the last time I went on this tirade, but it's just I think we're in a place in the format where there are other 1 mana options that I would rather be playing,
and I'm playing them and the blasts.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
I mean, that's what's my list. It's like all the stuff that's different from yours is it's like all the counter magic.
Yep.
You know, Cobble and I are both on a braid, which I think a braid is just a really good removal spell right now. It deals with Nagila. That's it sounds dumb, but it does in fact deal with
you
Nagila.
play with Pongo way too much.
I do play with Pongo way too much. Looking at the sorcery suites, the overlap.
I'm surprised you didn't ask me about Tainted Pact.
I mean, it's Forbidden Tutor, right? Like,
yeah. I figured it would elicit some sort of reaction there, but yeah, no. I mean, when I said at the beginning that I put every tutor capable of my colors in to get Godo, that's what it is. Unless you hit Helm when you're digging for Godo, then you're
big
most of the time really good. Yeah.
Yeah, in the sorcery suite, the overlap between us is we're both playing all 3 of us are playing Open the Armory and Steel Shaper's Gift. Ian and I are both playing Search for Glory, and then that's where the differences end. I'm playing Winds of Abandon. That's my big difference. Ian is on the 3 black tutors, Demonic Tutor, Diabolic Intent, Imperial Seal, and Cobble on Eldritch Evolution, Finale of Devastation, Shatter Skull Smashing. We're not doing any like groundbreaking stuff with these sorcery suites, right? You know, these are.
I should probably be on Shatter Skull, huh? It's not a bad idea.
Right.
Especially
I was looking for more
32
ways.
lands.
Yeah. Being able to deal with opposing stacks is something to be intentional about.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I've considered it, but then that means I have to work on finding a slot for it. And
So second switch is I literally have a basic mountain, and that would be a Shatter Skull Smashing. So there you go, audience.
I could probably do something along those lines of like moving one of my lands over into Shatter Skull Smashing, and that would probably be reasonable. But I'm also playing, as we look at the lands, I'm also playing 10 basic lands in my deck, which is a little bit of a remnant from when I was on what was it? Back to Basics in that list.
Back to Basics. Yeah.
But 32 lands in your list, Ian. Like I thought I was going to be the one coming in here heavy with like the most lands, but no, you beat me out with 32.
I mean, I really don't have, like, once again, card advantage in the command zone. And the curve of this deck is aggressively important. Like being able to go 1 mana, play probably either a stacks piece or cheap equipment, 2 mana, same thing, maybe tutor and equipment or something like that. And then 3 mana, play Arden, attach an equipment, swing, take out your opponent. That 1, 2, 3 curve is so aggressively important that I cannot afford to not be doing that, basically. So that's the 32 lands. I mean, it's the same amount I play in Winota. I think if you're trying to really cripple what your opponents are doing, to be clear, as I mentioned, I have 21 artifacts. So I do have a good amount of acceleration, but even then, like my combo piece is a 6 mana spell, right? So I think mine's the most turbo Godo of the 3 lists. So I think it's very important for me to get there. So
looking at some of the stuff that we all have in common, I'm not going to go over like we all have Plateau in our list. Gee, shocker. But we all 3 of us are on Urza Saga, which I think speaks very highly to the ability to grab like Skull Clamp or grab Grafdigger's Cage, or there's so many good 1 mana stuff like
Colossus Hammer.
Yeah.
Yeah, my original name for this deck list was just going to be Imperial Seal, get Colossus Hammer for the memes. But then I was like, I actually don't know if I'll ever go for that play pattern.
Yeah. So do you in your list, Cobble, as I'm looking at this, have like, is Gaia's Cradle just here because Gaia's Cradle's good? Or do you have like a thing you're doing with it also?
Tana.
Okay. So Gaia's Cradle Seal because Gaia's Cradle, I can't speak.
Gaia's Cradle.
I still can't say it. God damn it.
Gaia's Cradle is in there with crop rotation. Crop rotation is not just for Gaia's Cradle, but it's for Urza Saga as well. But very often, because there's 30 creatures in the list,
right,
and because we're running dorks, it is just going to be high value a lot of the time, and was one of the criteria that I used to be able to explain the lack of Dockside, because Dockside was in the list originally. And being able to reliably, people are going to nitpick the word reliably, but having reasonable access to Gaia's Cradle, when you know you're going to be on Hate Bears and you have Tana in the command zone, that can deliver a whole lot of flexibility,
right,
in being able to depend on having the mana resources that you need.
So here's my kind of like spice question here, Cobble. If you're already like not on Dockside because of the mana things, and you're really relying on that like creature land mana, why not play something like Stony Silence Null Rod?
Let me see.
For those at home who are going to have the gut reaction of, because that's not how equipment work. Yes, no, I know that.
Right.
But Arden circumvents those things.
Arden says, who cares?
So
Arden is a triggered ability.
The main one is Birthing Pod.
Yep. Okay. That's already super valid. Yeah.
So there were a couple of others, but Birthing Pod's the main one.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're really, the Birthing Pod's like a big focus for you.
Right. Like I said, it's sort of like a blood pod that has equipment.
Yeah.
And
smack pod.
Right. I love it. Well, as we kind of get here to the end of the episode, what are some of the things that we learned through brewing with Arden and these commanders? Ian, I'll kind of throw that over at you first. What were some things that you learned about in this process?
I really appreciated how much this deck could break parity on rule law effects, and specifically like a lot of stacks more than I was expecting it to. I think there's definitely some synergy with things that are equipments that aren't jankier equipments, and the ability to tap them, kind of like I was talking about earlier with things like Urza. I think there's some cute stuff you can do there. And there's a lot of like between Urza's Saga and I can't remember the name of this card. It is blue mana activation. It's 1 and a blue to cast it. It's like Survival of the Fittest, but for 1 mana artifacts.
Oh,
Artificer's Intuition.
Bam. Between that and Urza's Saga, there's an archetype there that is worth looking at, that provides a lot of value. And Urza's Saga obviously being a lot more like, quote, free because it's a land is something to think about. But Artificer's Intuition, I feel like, always suffered from being by itself. But now the fact that there are those two things that exist right now, I think that there is some archetypes that can work in that space. You obviously have to consider the fact that Dockside is a thing. You have to play around that. And if you're playing with a lot of small artifacts, you do feed into that. However, the more small artifacts you're playing with, you're also feeding into the fact that you can start using a lot more acceleration, because small artifacts are extremely easy to cast. So there's like a balance there, and there's a lot of cool fidgety stuff you can work within that space. And so that kind of got me excited.
Y'all are going to roll your eyes at me, but on the note of being able to tap equipment without it impacting anything is inspiring statuary.
Yeah,
basically giving all of your
you get a medium roll for that one.
Yeah, you get a medium roll. You basically give all your spells convoke, which is super fun.
Yeah,
and it's a pseudo mana rock itself, because you can tap it to add to the what does it say specifically? It's non-artifact spells you have or you cast have improvise. So an improvise is, convoke with artifacts effectively.
The inability to not cast artifacts and not pay for colored mana costs with that card is very painful.
Yes.
As someone who played a lot with it back in the day.
Yes. But if you want to get real spicy, if you can make Godo pretty cheap, pretty fast.
That is the thing you can do for sure.
Cobble, what are some of the things you learned from this, exercise?
I would say that this gave me more insight into Winota. Because I hadn't actually, I hadn't sleeved up Boros Winota before. And kind of my first real foray into studying it was as a Naya Winota, basically. And it kind of, it revealed a lot of the nuances of what makes Winota tick, but also kind of stuff that's outside the box of what Winota can do, because Winota doesn't have access to green, and the things that green brings to that, it's not as fast as, breakneck snowball Winota, but it is flexible And
well, it's the same reason that like Team or Malcolm exists as an archetype is because green gives you like such a redundancy of creature tutors that like it really does make it very realistic to like quote always have access to it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's kind of the thing that I got out of it was being able to kind of appreciate Winota more than I had before. I mean, I appreciated it, but there's a different level of appreciation when you really study something and really, practice with it and understand why certain things are in there and certain things aren't. But this also gave me appreciation for Blood Pod a little bit more. And even though I may not carry this list into the future, it kind of spawned another list that I'm enjoying that is using some of the things that I figured out in this list. So, and that list is being very successful right now. So this is something that happens often where you look in one place to examine A, and what you find is you're surprised to learn B, and that original context where you were looking for A and you found B, that really doesn't pan out. But if you take B over to this other context, it winds up being really good.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't have found it in that other context because you weren't looking for it over there. You only discovered it over here. And that, I think, is, kind of one of the foundational aspects of what Brewer's Choice is about. Right. It's about not necessarily, making decks that are going to be cEDH decks, but challenging the established canon and looking and exploring such that we find things that are fragments that can be used in other places to great effect.
So could you say that we're the Indiana Jones of cEDH?
I thought Indiana was the name of the dog.
Well, that marks my last appearance on this show. Thank you so much.
I would say, just to jump off of that, one of the things that, because Jeskai Stoneblade was kind of my B when I was looking at A, because, I kind of found it through playing Ojutai, and being like, how do I add red to this? Because if I add red to this, it's just like throwing gasoline on a fire and then just going to town. Yeah. But I think a lot of what I learned is that, first of all, I think equipment just in general are a lot better in cEDH than we give them credit for. I think something that Rebel has been yelling about that I agree with her on 100% is that Umezawa's Jete is just a really good Magic card and we should be playing it more. And
I think there's an asterisk there, but I get what you're
I think in like grindy decks, it does a lot of like
that's the asterisk.
Like in these grindy decks that like like Winota, I'm not saying you should play it, but like maybe it's worth playing with because it like the crowd control on it alone is so good.
There has been an argument for some time for like a Stoneforge package in Winota. Yeah. I don't think it's there, but it's something to think about.
But in a lot of this was an experiment as well in is it possible to build to scale effectively a modern deck into EDH? And I think in using a lot of the practices, and I've talked about this before, of using a lot of the like same type of heuristics that you use in building a modern deck and using those in building an EDH deck. And I think there is some stuff that we should maybe go back and go back to those classic ideas a little bit more. Because, you know, as I look at like a lot of the stuff that's getting played right now, it's like your one Grafdigger's Cage in your deck isn't enough hate, right? Like you need to be playing a density of it if you actually want to be hating on something. You know, you need to look at maybe playing more lands, maybe playing more dorks, maybe playing more counter spells. And I think there is some stuff there that maybe going back and like, I don't think going all the way to the same proportions is necessarily the correct answer. But I think if you use that and play around with it, it'll lead you in a positive direction is kind of.
Yeah. I mean, so for example, like when Underworld Breach first came out, right, there were a very small handful of people playing Breach to its full potential. And I was one of the few people who was insisting that LED Brain Freeze was a necessary component with Breach. And the only reason I insisted upon that was because it had literally just gotten banned out of Legacy.
Yeah.
So that was a pretty good indicator to me.
When stuff in Legacy gets banned, that's usually a good indicator that it's a good card.
Yeah. And so, but these were pieces that people were just like, oh, I don't know. Brain Freeze is literal garbage. And I was like, yes, it is. But
this card makes it better.
Yes. And sometimes it's just about looking at other formats, right? I mean, as you mentioned, the series y'all did that it was a part of was very instructive in looking at old things and seeing what the best things to come out of it were. Now, were those all tier 1 decks? Absolutely not.
Right.
Like not even slightly, but they did enough to explore new ideas that it was worth looking at.
Right. And I think Cobblepott, you said this before, where it's like through exploring, you know, I use as an example, like Shadow Bag, like maybe Shadow Bag itself isn't the archetype that gets really good, but you find something in there that works really well. And then that is the piece that you grab and pull and you go, okay, this is a really good thing that maybe I wouldn't have thought of before.
Yes.
But yeah.
Right. That's the process.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining me today. It is good this was a fun first episode for our first episode of 2022. We should be doing if all things go as planned next week, I think next week or in 2 weeks, we will be doing our 2021 cEDH awards, which I'm really excited about.
I have to record my thing.
Yeah, you do. Cobble, it's going to be me, Cobble, and Pongo are going to be the hosts of the awards. And we've got some great presenters, including Ian. But that will be here in, I want to say 2 weeks, I think, if everybody sends me their stuff on time. So keep an eye out for that. Ian, what's going on over on Comedian MTG?
Yeah, so I got some stuff going on. I just was featured on a gameplay episode of cEDH Brazil that we recorded quite some time ago. So that was pretty cool. I just tweeted that one out. On my own channel, I did a recent live brew with Hire from Playing with Power for Satoru Umezawa. That was super cool. We talked about all like the avenues of that deck. Blue-black Thoracle sneak attack's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Doing a lot of deck techs lately. While the tournament scene is a little bit on the hush hush right now because of we're kind of in between tournament season. People were receding from their COVID holes, but now everyone's kind of going back in. Yeah. So tournaments were kind of on a DL for a little minute. So I've been doing a lot of deck techs, and that's been really fun because you know, I kind of started this format as a brewer and I still enjoy it a lot. So
yeah. Well,
as my constant appearance here would indicate.
You know, we love you. Well, that about wraps things up for us here today. Just a quick reminder that you can follow us on Twitter at SculptyBoys, BOIS, or you can find a direct link in our link tree in the description below. I want to also give an extra thanks to our patrons. Just to shout out a few of our loyal patrons: Justin, Michael Levine, CZ, Dionychus, James Holly, Jason Bialik, Matt Boehner and Senior Coupon, thank you so much. Those are some of our highest tiered patrons. Thank you all for supporting the channel and supporting the show. We greatly appreciate it. If you too would like to become a patron and support this and get some early content, you can head on over to patreon.com/themindsculptors or check out the link in the description. This unfortunately will not be coming up early because we had to record this the Friday before it comes out because of, the whole holiday season. But with that being said, thank you all for joining us. And from all of us here at the Mind Sculptors, I'm Callahan, and we'll see you next time.
I'm in line with the stars, I'm in sync with the earth. 10 toes deep, flower child from the turf. I never switch sides, like even when I die, I'ma ride for the squad, light up ties in the hearse. I've been on a vibe, kinda hard to describe. I'm in between, I'm good and it's fine, but I'm tired of the grind. Then I come alive in the night to realize I'm in the middle of the time of my life. I'm never so packed for the stack, never lied on the rap. Got a bag from the way that I write it. Queen looking Tyson, who that ass survived doing 80 to the house. Then I hit it to the sky, changed haters on a tirade. Talking to their grip in the face, be still, let that hate stuff fade. We all want the same, we all want a meal in the safe. I wanna live like I'm trying to reach enlightenment. Trail spill from my lips, feel big from the bib. Take a sip till I pass out. Try and get grit, but it don't make sense. Cause you can lose life on this fast route. Yeah, turn thoughts to a cash cow. I might flip that to the glass house. I don't need the accolades, I'm in love with the chase. I just wanna eat, save a spot at the table. Beast with the slap, pin myself on the map. You long with the wind, but we knowing that it's cap. 5-hour flights, couple nights at the flat. To be real, couldn't see me making moves while I'm at. I'm still on the grind, limit time when I chat. I'm burning down sage, keep the demons away. When I write it, give a piece of myself to the page. I don't do it for the praise, love, that's just how I'm made.
Truth in the glass in the mirror.
Yeah.
Do it at me, old man, trying to pass in the fear. You're the first one to talk, but the last one to hear.